December 3, 1942, a nondescript office building on Unter den Linden, Berlin, 2:47 a.m. Oberst Heinrich Müller-Brandt squinted through the haze of cigarette smoke at the intelligence photographs scattered across his mahogany desk. The grainy aerial reconnaissance images showed what appeared to be the world's largest building, a sprawling, mile-long factory complex in the American heartland of Michigan. His weathered fingers, scarred from shrapnel at Verdun a quarter-century earlier, traced the outline of the mysterious structure. "Mein Gott," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant rumble of Allied bombers returning from another raid on the fatherland. "What in God's name are the Americans building in there?" What Müller-Brandt could not have comprehended, as he stared at those innocuous black-and-white photographs in the pre-dawn darkness of wartime Berlin, was that he was looking at the physical manifestation of America's transition from a consumer economy to the most devastating war machine in human history. This wasn't merely a factory, it was an industrial weapon of unprecedented magnitude, a temple to mass production that would systematically dismantle the very foundations of German military strategy. The building he was examining, Ford's Willow Run plant, represented something far more terrifying than any Panzer division or Luftwaffe squadron. It was the industrialization of annihilation itself, a concrete and steel manifestation of American abundance that would bury the Third Reich under an avalanche of aircraft, each one containing precisely 1,550,000 individual components, rolling off the production line every 63 minutes. The mathematics of destruction were already being loaded into those assembly lines, though German intelligence had no framework to comprehend what they were witnessing. While Nazi economists calculated war production in terms of monthly outputs and quarterly targets, Henry Ford's engineers had revolutionized the very concept of manufacturing timelines. They had achieved something that defied European understanding. They had transformed the construction of a four-engine heavy bomber, a machine of staggering complexity, containing more individual parts than some entire German factories produced in a year, into a predictable, rhythmic process as reliable as the ticking of a metronome. The consolidated B-24 Liberator, the aircraft emerging from this industrial cathedral, was not merely an airplane. It was a flying inventory of American industrial supremacy. Each bomber contained 1,550,000 separate components, 360,000 rivets, holding together aluminum sheets, rolled in plants across Pennsylvania, 30,000 bolts machined in workshops from Detroit to Denver, 15,000 electrical connections soldered by workers who had never seen combat, but whose labor would prove more decisive than any battlefield victory. The landing gear alone required 18,500 individual parts, more components than many German aircraft contained in their entirety. The Pratt & Whitney R. 1,830 engines, 4 per aircraft, each consisted of 6,500 precisely machined elements, from pistons forged in Connecticut foundries to spark plugs manufactured in Ohio plants that operated around the clock. But raw numbers, staggering though they were, told only part of the story. The true revolution lay in Ford's systematic dismantling of traditional aircraft manufacturing. Where European aircraft companies employed master craftsmen who hand-fitted each component with artisanal precision, Ford had broken down the construction of a heavy bomber into 8,000 distinct operations, each one so simplified that a worker could master it in hours rather than years. The company had taken the most complex machine of the modern age and reduced its assembly to a series of repetitive motions as predictable as breathing. At the peak of production, a new B-24 Liberator was completed every 63 minutes. Not every hour, every 63 minutes. This meant that while German aircraft manufacturers celebrated the monthly completion of a dozen fighters, Ford was delivering a fully operational four-engine heavy bomber faster than most people could eat lunch. The implications were mathematically catastrophic for German war planning. In the time it took a Messerschmitt Me 262 to complete a single combat sortie, approximately 90 minutes from takeoff to landing, Ford had delivered 1.4 new heavy bombers to the United States Army Air Forces. The assembly line itself defied comprehension. Stretching 3,200 feet from end to end, longer than the Bismarck and the Tirpitz combined, The Willow Run production line moved with mechanical inevitability. Every 37 seconds, another major assembly component was installed on the aircraft moving down the line. Wings were attached every 18 minutes. Engines were mounted and tested every 15 minutes. The electrical systems, containing 7 miles of wiring per aircraft, were installed and checked every 12 minutes. The tail section, weighing 2,800 pounds and containing 45,000 individual rivets, was attached every 8 minutes. German observers, when they finally comprehended the scale of American production, would describe feeling as if they were witnessing the mechanization of divine creation. Where God had required 6 days to create the world, Ford had reduced the birth of a weapon of unprecedented destructive capability to slightly over an hour. The plant operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with 3 shifts of workers who moved through the factory like blood cells through arteries, each one carrying out their designated function in the greater organism of production. The workforce itself represented a sociological revolution disguised as an industrial one. Ford had recruited 42,000 employees for Willow Run, including 25,000 women who had never worked in heavy manufacturing. These were housewives from Detroit suburbs, farm girls from rural Michigan, grandmothers whose sons were fighting in the Pacific, all of them transformed into precision manufacturers of the most sophisticated military hardware on Earth. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a propaganda symbol. She was a statistical reality multiplied by tens of thousands, each one capable of installing 300 rivets per hour, with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The economic implications were equally staggering. Ford had invested $200 million in the Willow Run facility, more than the entire German aircraft industry's annual budget. The plant consumed 1.2 million kilowatt-hours of electricity per day, enough to power a city of 150,000 people. The raw materials flowing into the facility represented an economic mobilization of unprecedented scale. 1,000 tons of aluminum per day, 500 tons of steel, 200 tons of copper wiring, 150 tons of rubber for tires and seals. This was abundance weaponized. American consumer culture retooled for the systematic destruction of fascism, but perhaps most terrifying to German strategic planners was the scalability of Ford's achievement. Willow Run wasn't an isolated miracle of production. It was a template that could be replicated. By 1943, similar megafactories were under construction across the American Midwest. Boeing's Plant 2 in Seattle was producing B-17 Flying Fortresses at comparable rates. North American's Inglewood facility was churning out P-51 Mustang fighters every 49 minutes. Consolidated's San Diego plant was manufacturing additional B-24 seconds every 100 minutes. The Americans hadn't just built a single superfactory. They had created an entire industrial ecosystem dedicated to the mass production of aerial destruction. The strategic implications were becoming clear to German military planners, though many refused to accept what the mathematics were telling them. The Luftwaffe, which had begun the war with approximately 4,000 combat aircraft, was now facing an American aircraft industry that could replace that entire force every 6 weeks. German aircraft production, despite frantic efforts to increase output, peaked at 40,000 aircraft per year in 1944. American factories were producing 100,000 aircraft annually by 1943, and that number was increasing every month. The psychological impact on German personnel who encountered these statistics was profound and demoralizing. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting a phenomenon they called the endless stream, the seemingly infinite number of American aircraft that appeared over European skies. What they were witnessing was the physical manifestation of Ford's 63-minute production cycle multiplied across dozens of similar facilities. Every hour of every day, American factories were delivering new combat aircraft to European airfields faster than German forces could destroy them. The intelligence reports reaching Berlin became increasingly desperate in tone. Agent Cicero, operating from the British Embassy in Turkey, transmitted detailed information about Allied aircraft production figures that German analysts initially dismissed as disinformation because the numbers seemed impossible. A single American factory was producing heavy bombers faster than the entire German aircraft industry could manufacture training planes. The report spoke of production lines that never stopped, of factories that operated with machine-like precision, of an industrial capacity that seemed to violate the basic laws of economics and physics. The human stories emerging from Willow Run only added to German bewilderment. American workers were earning $1.20 per hour, more than many German skilled craftsmen made in a day, while producing weapons that would be used to destroy German cities. The plant cafeteria served 45,000 meals per day, more food than was available to entire German towns under wartime rationing. The employee parking lot contained 15,000 automobiles, representing more private vehicle ownership than existed in most German states. Quality control at Willow Run defied German understanding of mass production principles. Each completed bomber underwent 48 hours of intensive testing before delivery, including full engine runs, systems checks, and test flights. The rejection rate for completed aircraft was less than 2%, a figure that German quality inspectors found statistically impossible for mass-produced goods. Yet Ford had achieved this through systematic standardization and worker training programs that turned complex aircraft assembly into a series of repeatable, measurable processes. The spare parts production alone represented a logistical achievement that dwarfed anything in German military experience. Ford was manufacturing and stockpiling replacement components for aircraft that hadn't yet been built, anticipating maintenance needs for bombers that wouldn't roll off the assembly line for months. The spare parts inventory at Willow Run contained 3.2 million individual components, representing complete replacement airframes for over 2,000 additional aircraft. As 1,943 progressed, German intelligence began to grasp the true horror of what they were facing. This wasn't just about aircraft production. It was about the systematic application of American industrial principles to warfare itself. Ford had taken the assembly line techniques that had revolutionized automobile manufacturing and applied them to instruments of mass destruction. The result was a production capacity that could literally bury the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of new aircraft. The maintenance and support systems surrounding each Willow Run bomber represented another level of American industrial sophistication. Every B-24 that rolled off the production line was accompanied by a complete logistics package: specialized tools, technical manuals, spare parts inventories, and trained maintenance personnel. The Americans weren't just mass-producing aircraft. They were mass-producing entire support ecosystems that could keep those aircraft operational under combat conditions. German attempts to replicate American production methods met with systematic failure. The Nazi economy, built on conquest and slave labor, lacked the fundamental infrastructure for mass production. German aircraft factories remained essentially craft operations, dependent on skilled workers and hand-fitted components. Attempts to introduce assembly line techniques founded on material shortages, transportation bottlenecks, and the fundamental incompatibility between American mass production methods and the German economic system. The strategic bombing campaign emerging from American factories represented warfare on an unprecedented scale. By 1944, the combined bomber offensive was delivering more explosive tonnage on German targets in a single week than the Luftwaffe had dropped on Britain during the entire Battle of Britain. The B-24 seconds rolling off the Willow Run assembly line weren't just individual aircraft. They were components of a strategic bombing force that would systematically dismantle German industrial capacity. The fuel consumption alone represented a mobilization of American energy resources that defied German comprehension. Each B-24 consumed 2,400 gallons of aviation fuel for a typical combat mission over Europe, with hundreds of bombers operating daily from bases across Britain and Italy. American fuel requirements exceeded the total petroleum production of the German Reich. The Americans weren't just outproducing German aircraft, they were outproducing German energy supplies by orders of magnitude. The crew training programs supporting Willow Run production represented another dimension of American industrial warfare. Ford was producing bombers faster than the Army Air Forces could train crews to fly them. New training facilities were constructed across the American South and West, each one capable of graduating complete bomber crews every few weeks. The Americans had industrialized not just aircraft production, but pilot and crew production as well. The economic multiplier effects were equally staggering. Each B-24 bomber required components from over 1,500 different suppliers across 47 states. The Willow Run plant had created an industrial ecosystem that employed nearly 500,000 Americans in direct and indirect production roles. This was economic mobilization on a scale that the autarkic German economy simply could not match. The technological sophistication hidden within each Willow Run bomber represented decades of American industrial advancement compressed into wartime urgency. The Norden bomb site alone contained 2,000 precision-machined components and represented a level of mechanical sophistication that German engineers found difficult to comprehend. The aircraft's radar systems, radio equipment, and navigation instruments incorporated electronic technologies that were largely unknown in European aircraft manufacturing. As German defenses began encountering the products of American mass production in increasing numbers, the psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots became severe. They reported feeling overwhelmed not just by the quantity of Allied aircraft, but by their obvious quality and technological sophistication. These weren't crude, hastily built weapons. They were precisely manufactured instruments of aerial warfare, each one identical to thousands of others, each one representing the pinnacle of American industrial capability. The maintenance records for Willow Run aircraft operating in combat zones revealed another aspect of American industrial superiority. B-24 seconds manufactured at Ford's facility demonstrated significantly higher operational availability rates than aircraft produced by traditional methods. The standardization and quality control built into Ford's production process translated directly into combat effectiveness. American bombers stayed in the air longer, required less maintenance, and suffered fewer mechanical failures than their German counterparts. The intelligence reports reaching German high command became increasingly apocalyptic in tone. American aircraft production wasn't just outpacing German capabilities, it was accelerating. Ford engineers were continuously refining the Willow Run production process, reducing the time required to complete each bomber while simultaneously improving quality and reliability. What had begun as a 63-minute production cycle was being systematically reduced toward an ultimate goal of completing one bomber every 55 minutes. The global implications were becoming clear to anyone with access to complete production statistics. American aircraft factories weren't just supporting the war in Europe, they were simultaneously supplying aircraft to Pacific theater operations, to British and Commonwealth forces, to Soviet Union allies, and to resistance movements across occupied Europe. The productive capacity emerging from American factories was reshaping the global balance of power in real time. The winter of 1943 brought a series of intelligence reports that would fundamentally alter German strategic planning. Agent networks operating near American industrial centers began transmitting detailed observations of factory output that seemed to belong to science fiction rather than industrial reality. The reports described production lines that operated with mechanical precision, factories that never stopped production, and output figures that violated every assumption about wartime manufacturing capacity. One particularly detailed report from an agent observing the Willow Run facility described the almost supernatural rhythm of American production. Every 63 minutes, precisely timed, a complete 4-engine bomber would emerge from the factory and taxi to the adjacent airfield. The agent reported watching this process for an entire day, documenting the mechanical inevitability of American production. 22 complete bombers in a single day, each one containing enough aluminum to build 2 German fighters, each one carrying more offensive capability than an entire German bomber squadron. The report continued with observations that would have seemed impossible to German military planners. The American workers moved through their tasks with mechanical precision, each one trained to perform specific operations within exact time parameters. There was no wasted motion, no inefficiency, no deviation from prescribed procedures. The entire factory operated like a vast machine, with human workers serving as precisely calibrated components in a system designed for maximum output. But perhaps most disturbing to German analysts were the agent's observations about American worker morale. These were not slave laborers working under threat of punishment. These were voluntary workers who seemed to take genuine pride in their contribution to the war effort. The agent reported observing workers staying after their shifts to perfect their techniques, competing with each other to improve production rates, celebrating each completed bomber as a personal achievement. This was a motivated workforce contributing to an industrial effort that combined patriotic duty with economic opportunity. The economic intelligence was equally disturbing. American workers at Willow Run were earning wages that exceeded the salaries of German military officers. They drove private automobiles to work, lived in single-family homes, and enjoyed consumer goods that were unavailable to German civilians even before the war. The Americans had somehow managed to combine total war mobilization with rising living standards, a feat that German economists considered theoretically impossible. The strategic implications were becoming mathematically inescapable. German aircraft production, operating at maximum capacity with total resource allocation, could not produce aircraft fast enough to replace combat losses. American factories were producing new aircraft faster than German forces could destroy them, even under the most optimistic scenarios for German combat effectiveness. The arithmetic of industrial warfare was delivering an unavoidable verdict. Germany was being systematically buried under an avalanche of American production. March 15, 1944, Berghof, Hitler's Alpine retreat, 11:30 p.m. The final, crushing revelation arrived in the form of a captured American technical manual, retrieved from a downed B-24 over Bavaria and translated by German intelligence specialists. The document, marked Ford Motor Company Technical Bulletin WR4403, contained detailed production statistics for the Willow Run facility that defied every assumption about wartime manufacturing. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, reviewing the translation in Hitler's mountain retreat, felt the blood drain from his face as he absorbed the implications of what he was reading. The manual documented not just current production figures, but planned expansions that would double output within 6 months. Ford engineers had identified bottlenecks in the current production process and designed solutions that would reduce the bomber completion time from 63 minutes to 45 minutes by the end of 1944. The Americans weren't just outproducing German industry. They were accelerating their advantage with systematic improvements that treated industrial warfare as an engineering problem to be solved through continuous optimization. But the most devastating section of the captured manual was titled Production Capacity Analysis, Theoretical Maximum Output. Ford engineers had calculated that the Willow Run facility, operating at absolute maximum capacity with minor modifications to existing systems, could complete one B-24 Liberator every 37 minutes. This wasn't speculation or propaganda. This was sober engineering analysis based on detailed time and motion studies and factory efficiency calculations. Göring set down the translation and stared out the window at the snow-covered Alps, his mind struggling to process the mathematical implications. At maximum theoretical output, Ford's single factory could produce more heavy bombers in 1 month than the entire German aircraft industry could manufacture in 6 months. The Americans hadn't just achieved industrial superiority, they had achieved industrial dominance on a scale that rendered German military strategy obsolete. The captured manual also contained detailed cost analyses that revealed another dimension of American industrial superiority. Ford was producing B-24 bombers for $215,000 each, including all materials, labor, and overhead costs. This was less than Germany was spending to manufacture a single Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. Despite the B-24's vastly greater size and complexity, the Americans had somehow made heavy bombers cheaper to produce than German fighters. The manual's appendices contained supplier lists that documented the scope of American industrial mobilization. Over 1,500 companies across 47 states were contributing components to each Willow Run bomber. This represented a level of industrial coordination that the German Reich, despite its totalitarian control systems, had never achieved. American capitalism, operating under wartime emergency conditions, had accomplished a degree of economic organization that surpassed anything possible under Nazi central planning. The psychological impact on German leadership was profound and immediate. These weren't exaggerated propaganda claims or intelligence estimates subject to interpretation. These were detailed technical documents prepared by American engineers for their own internal use. The statistics were presented with the dry, matter-of-fact tone of industrial planning, making their implications even more disturbing. The Americans discussed the production of weapons of mass destruction with the same analytical detachment they had once applied to automobile manufacturing. The final entry in Goering's diary, written that night in his private quarters at Berghof, captured the full horror of German realization. We are fighting not just America, but American industry. Every day, their factories deliver more aircraft than our entire Air Force possessed at the beginning of the war. We calculated that we were fighting 180 million Americans. We failed to understand that we were fighting 180 million Americans, supported by the most powerful industrial economy in human history. We cannot win this war. We cannot even hope to survive it. We are drowning in American abundance, and there is no shore in sight. The mathematical finality was inescapable. German aircraft production, straining at maximum capacity with total resource allocation, was being systematically overwhelmed by American factories operating with such efficiency that they treated the production of heavy bombers as routine manufacturing operations. The war had become a contest between German industrial desperation and American industrial abundance, and abundance was winning with mathematical certainty. In the end, the story of Willow Run represents more than just aircraft production statistics or wartime industrial achievement. It embodies the moment when American capitalism fully awakened to its own potential for organized violence, when the productive capacity that had created the world's highest standard of living was systematically redirected toward the destruction of fascism. Ford's 63-minute production cycle wasn't just an engineering triumph. It was the sound of democracy defending itself with precision, rhythm, and overwhelming industrial force. The German spies who first observed American bomber production were witnessing not just factory operations, but the physical manifestation of American values transformed into weapons of liberation. They were seeing abundance, weaponized, prosperity militarized, and industrial democracy prepared to bury totalitarianism under an avalanche of precisely manufactured freedom, delivered every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day, until victory was complete and the world was safe for the kind of society that could build such factories in the first place.